Greetings from the Finance and Investment Cell Shri College of Commerce. We welcome you to Scholar Spectrum, an interview series by FIC SRCC. Today we have with us a noted Indian academic, historian, and food critic, Dr. Pushpesh Pant. Sir is a retired professor of international relations from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, one of India's leading experts on international relations as well as Indian cuisine. Sir has also written for a number of major publications like Forbes, Open, Outlook, Times of India, and the Tribune as a columnist. He has authored many bestseller books like India, the Cookbook, which was also named by the New York Times as one of the best cookbooks of the year. He was also featured in an interview in the Australian. Professor has widely published on travel and tourism with over a dozen books to his credit. Sir was awarded the Padma Shri by the Government of India in 2016. We are extremely grateful to have you with us, sir.
I'm delighted to be with you, Chad.
Sir, the first question that we have for you is, what are your views on the recent distrust shown by the US towards the UN and other affiliated bodies since Trump came into power? What will be the impact if the biggest player in the world opts out of it?
Well, you see, the only problem I have is with the word recent. I think the United States of America has always shown a great disdain to the organization called United Nations. And it is not only the United Nations. If you see the history of international organization, starts in 20th century with the League of Nations, which was formed at the end of the First World War. And the inspiration for the League of Nations was President Woodrow Wilson of the United States of America. But the United States of America did not join the League of Nations. And part of the reason of the failure of the League, UN is after all a successor of the United Nations. It is a successor of the League of Nations. And many of the organizations you refer to, the specialized agency of United Nations, were also built up on embryos of agencies left behind by League of Nations. So the United States of America's reluctance to join an international organization and be held responsible jointly with other major powers is a major cause of the weakness, if not of the total failure of the United Nations. That's one. Then any system, the United Nations was actually a system of international order imposed on the rest of the world by the victors in the Second World War. The United Nations came into existence according to what is called the Atlantic Charter. There were three major conferences, Tehran, Potsdam, Yalta, between the three big, the Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. Other countries were allowed to join in, but they had no decisive say in the blueprint for the United Nations. So this is an imprint of a victor's designed to create order in a post-war world, in which the vanquished did not have any say, which the rest of the world didn't have much say. It did not take into account the whole process of, shall we say, decolonization, which was underway during these years, continued, and the United Nations adopted in the General Assembly, to go back in history, decolonization resolution, which was December 1960. So which means that from 1945 to 60, 15 years, the decolonization process, the anti-imperial struggle, the freedom struggle of the new nations was neglected. That's one part. Even more interesting is this, that the system was not very egalitarian. You had a Security Council which had veto holding members, which could impose a stalemate on any decision taken by the General Assembly. I mean, they were United States, Russia, Britain, France, and China. And please keep in mind that China at this stage was not the People's Republic of China, which was the major landmass and the most populous nation. It was Formosa, also known as Taiwan. So to my mind, the United Nations has always suffered from multiple weaknesses, infirmities, for which United States of America itself is responsible. It is perpetuated. One more thing which we should not forget in this question, because you seem to be taking United Nations a little more seriously than it deserves to be taken in real political terms in contemporary politics. When I was younger, and believe me, I was young at one stage, when I was studying international relations way back in 60s, there was a war going on in Congo, civil war going on in Congo. And if you read the story of civil war in Congo, there is a very interesting memoir of 1,000 Days in Kennedy's presidency by Arthur Schlesinger junior who was a speechwriter, come assistant, come amanuensis, etc. There is a very interesting conversation recorded there, which is also confirmed by Sorensen, Ted Sorensen, who was also a contemporary in White House, that can we use United Nations to further the interests of American foreign policy in Congo? So the United Nations was passing resolutions, sending out peacekeeping operations, which served primarily the American interests. And you see, this was the time when the Russians under Khrushchev offered a troika proposal. The United Nations should be managed by three countries, not only United Nations domination, United States domination, but this never came out of it. Because United Nations at that stage was a rich nation, was funding a lot of United Nations activities, and thought it was an extended agency of the State Department. Now, if you keep that in mind, I could even go earlier. I could go even earlier to 1950s, when just at the peak of the Korean War, India made a very interesting proposal. When there was a stalemate because of the veto in the Security Council, the Indian delegation presented a resolution which is called the Uniting for Peace Resolution, and they bypassed the Security Council, and something could be done about peacekeeping in the Korean Peninsula. But now, Vishal, rather than have all these historical details, the 3 examples or 4 examples are enough, that it is the United States, when it realized that it could be beaten by in its own game in the United Nations Security Council, they have never allowed the United Nations General Assembly to play a role like it did in the Korean War in the 1950s. That's one part. Now, I'm really, it might seem that I'm a very anti-UN person, but all my 50 years of study of international relations has made me confirmed in a belief that it is a useless organization. Take any major crisis. Take a crisis in the war in the Middle East. The United Nations the United Nations representative Count Foch Bernadotte got killed in the early fighting in the Middle East in 46, 47. You take the Kashmir dispute, the United Nations only played a meddlesome role. You go to Vietnam, they failed to bring peace to Vietnam, although there was a Geneva International Conference in 1954. You have the Middle East, they have failed to play a role in Palestinian versus Israeli conflict. You take any conflict in any part of the world, you take the Cuban Missile Crisis. So ultimately you come to the conclusion that the United Nations is a very overrated, very expensive organization. Be it Africa, be it Latin America, be it Far East, it is, and ultimately it does compromise. So when the Americans normalized their relationship with China, People's Republic of China, Nixon and Kissinger took to Mao Zedong's court, out, they very unceremoniously eased out Taiwan Formosa from the Security Council seat and gave the seat to PRC, which is part of their problems at the moment. So, I mean, I don't think, and you know, you have another interesting rider to your question. So what happens if America opts out of it? It doesn't really make a difference. I mean, if the Americans, it is a well-known fact that close to 97 to 98% of the budget of the United Nations is spent on tax-free salaries and perks and retirements of the UN officials. So the organization is an expensive organization. It is a self-serving organization. It is a sanctimonious organization which keeps making ethical, high-sounding statements. And it doesn't really make a difference to anybody except a few specialized agencies like maybe WHO, which again are controversial after the Wuhan coronavirus crisis. And again, if you see what the world needs and what the WHO or UNESCO or UNICEF talk about, so they are good, nice sounding moral principles, but effectively they don't seem to make an impact on the world at all. So I would say it would not make too great a difference if UN, like League of Nations, ceased to exist.
Okay, so the next question would be, given that 14% of India's import are from China and at least 16 unicorn have a minimum of 1 Chinese investor, it is close to impossible to boycott the country. So how much does individual effort of not using Chinese goods decrease their dependence?
Oh, very good question. I think, you know, I will ask the second part of the question first. I don't think that it is very feasible to boycott China totally, because India's phenomenal economic growth in recent years has been dependent on imports of what you call advanced pharmaceutical intermediaries from China, a whole lot of other implements and intermediaries which we get from China. which go into the value addition of our own exports. So to boycott Chinese goods, to impose a ban on them totally, would be like shooting ourselves on the foot. It is not only India has this problem, it is a problem which Americans have very majorly. Like the Americans this morning have said that they are going to impose a ban on advanced chip makers. But then if they do that, the American companies are going to lose the comparative advantages they had of a high quality, low cost product comparatively which they were selling into the rest of the world. So it was a mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship as long as it was not soured between India and China and India and America. And America and China to be more precise. Now the problem is that you take an example like China and West Germany. Angela Merkel has said so that it is impossible for the German companies to disentangle themselves from China in less than 4 or 5 years. They have made billions of marks of investment in Huawei. The same is the case with Britain. Same is the case with, to a lesser extent, with France. So China has, in recent past, woven such a complex web to draw everybody in its international trade relationship that what you are talking with the unicorns in India applies to practically everybody else in the world. You have a very interesting relationship where you have the 10 ASEAN countries in India's immediate neighborhood, which have which are the topmost trading partners, export and import for China. In recent past, when relationship between Australia and China has soured, we have suddenly discovered what was the dependence of Australians on the Chinese, both in terms of imports and exports. Now, the problem is the Chinese, ever since Xi Jinping took over power, has unveiled a very ambitious One Belt, One Road project, which is billions of dollars in infrastructure investment in terms of economic and technical assistance to countries which are parties to it. And people have fallen for this debt trap situation where they accept Chinese aid either because they maybe genuinely believe in what China is going to give them, B, they have a corrupt regime, they have an inefficient ruling elite, which finds it convenient to line its pockets. But when China gives the aid, it is not without strings. It lays claims to important strategic ports. It has infrastructural projects like it has in Cambodia to build cities and hotels and resorts and so on. And when the country fails to pay back the interest of the loan, Chinese claim this land, which has been leased out to them, and begin to exercise extraterritorial rights on them. So this is the kind of thing which Indians also have fallen into the trap of. Indians have, of course, resisted the One Belt, One Road scheme because it passes through our territory occupied by Pakistan illegally, handed over to China in Ladakh, Aksai Chin region. But the point is that we also have allowed our international trade to depend very much on Chinese imports and exports. Now it's interesting, during Mr. Manmohan Singh's prime ministership, India suddenly allowed China to become its largest trading partner as a country in terms of goods of imports, etc., displacing the United States of America. Now, please consider, we don't import oil from China, but it is ahead of Saudi Arabia, Iran, or UAE, or any oil importing country which India has. We don't import, obviously, armaments like we do from Russia and Israel and other countries, or France, Rafale, without importing any expensive armaments, without importing any oil, which is a very valuable commodity. We have allowed in the past 10, 15 years Chinese trade with India to have a turnover which comes to almost $100 billion, close to $100 billion, which is also very badly imbalanced against India in favor of China. So look at it this way. Why did this happen and how did this we allow it to happen? So if we allow it to happen, then it becomes a token, symbolic statement, patriotic when we have a border problem to say boycott Chinese goods. It is, I mean, most people in India would not even know what a Chinese good is. If you are not a professional dealing with these things and the government can't advertise each single brand, the Chinese have brands like Oppo, Vivo, Mi, and so on. And you might even have an Apple phone which is 90% built in China. So what do you do about that? You have refrigerators which are named Haier, televisions named TCL, and you don't. The Chinese have been very clever about marketing this. But now to get back to the question which you asked, the individual boycott doesn't make a difference. So you may have banned TikTok, you may ban PUBG or whatever it is. You may say WeChat. How many people are affected by this? You know, a microscopic minority of people who have access to high-speed net or a mobile telephony network may probably are inconvenienced. But the point is the democratization of mobile telephony in this country is made possible by cheap Chinese telephones. Now, similarly, you have other electrical appliances. So what individuals use is only the microscopic tip of the proverbial iceberg. The real value of this trade lies in what the government buys, what the industries buy. There are Indian companies which have set up units, not only the American companies like TCS, like pharma companies like Retd, pharma companies like Arvindo Pharmaceuticals. Now, Infosys at one time was represented there. So what happens is that we can cut down what our dependence, but it is not going to happen overnight. An individual saying that it's not like the Swadeshi movement of Gandhiji's times, that I will not use cloth manufactured in British mills or imported from Manchester. And please, Akshat, remember, even then the majority of the Indians did not boycott the British thing. It was only the hardcore followers of Gandhi who took to burning cloths and adopting khadi. And even today, with all the lip service paid to Gandhi, even in the Atmanirbhar India, Xi Jinping can be taken to Sabarmati and shown the Gandhiji ka charkha and made to play with it. But how many people in the country use handloom? Forget about khadi, rough khadi. How much about the power looms thing? How many use Indian textiles? And the textiles in the ready-made garments market which come from China, whether it is cheap fake shoes like Reebok or Adidas made through in a fake Chinese company, these are things which are not the most valuable part of the trade. Let's go into how much business big Indian companies are doing with China, are dependent on them, how much dependence of India is on Chinese infrastructural projects, from mills to chimneys. You only hear about them when an accident takes place. When there is an accident in the chimney and some people die, then you realize that the Chinese were building it. Some Chinese engineers got crushed under it or something. Then you suddenly realize. So now today India says that the 400 crore rupee contract has been cancelled with China in the railway sector. Then it suddenly dawns on you that there was a big enough contract given by government to the Chinese government or the Chinese company. So the real problem is that business which government does with China, business which big Indian companies, maybe Adani does with China, or the Tatas and Birlas and others do through either them or their closely held companies. You have companies in China which is like Mahindra Satyam, like Mahindra and Mahindra, and so on and so forth. So please make a list of companies which are active in China from the FIC list, from the Government of India Ministry of External Affairs list, and try to combine that how the combined business done by them with China is far more important than the individuals buying a Redmi phone, a Vivo phone, or Oppo phone, which is 4,000, 6,000 to 8,000. Again, going to be used again and again and again by a poor man, not being replaced with every time a new one comes.
Yes, sir.
Sir, the next question is, various countries such as Yemen or Zimbabwe are in the middle of different types of crises. On humanitarian grounds, what aid can be given by countries who are in a better position as compared to them?
Now, this is a nicely framed question, but I think slightly loosely phrased question. When you say who are in a better position than them, now everybody is practically in a better position than the poor Yemenis. They are one of the most distressed countries in the world, with the civil war having been going on for years. One of the worst marked cases of malnutrition in the world are outside Sahel countries are found in Yemen. Now, so if you say that any country better placed than them can give them humanitarian aid, will that country be allowed to render humanitarian aid? And is there something called truly humanitarian aid in international relations? All aid which you give to any country has political overtones and undertones. You give it to protect your interests. Now take the case of Yemen. It is divided in two parts, the northern part and the southern part. The rebels are Shias held by Iran. Southern part is contested with Sunnis held with Saudi Arab. Now Saudi Arab is next door, Oman, Muscat is next door, UAE is next door. So they are in a position geographically to render humanitarian help. They are also in a position to render help strategically to curb the civil war. The same applies to Iran to the north, which is at the moment in an economic doldrums because of American sanctions, but it is also pretty close to assisting. But are they going to render humanitarian assistance? Because all these parties, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran, are vitally involved in the fighting there. They are partisan parties. They are helping one faction, the Houthis, or the others. Now, what happens is, it is impossible to imagine that any external country which is farther removed may be better off, maybe it is United States of America, but will it be allowed to render humanitarian assistance, and why should it? Because they have Islamophobia, they have a problem that the aid is going to be wasted, is like a hole in the bucket situation. There might be other countries a little more further removed like India. What interest does India have in rendering, shall we say, humanitarian interest? Because you always render humanitarian interest on the grounds of shared values, shared ethnicity, shared past cultural ties, and your capacity to do so. Now, the Indians would have problems in the coronavirus days to undertake a lots of humanitarian relief work within the subcontinent. Forget about Pakistan, but within, say, Bangladesh, Nepal, and within the country itself. So would you have some aid to spare? Now, you take the European Union, they would be better off than Yemenis, they would be better off than Zimbabwe. But also there would be the other question that any humanitarian aid which any country in Europe or elsewhere gives to Yemen or Zimbabwe, or in a situation like this, is it not going to be totally wasted? Take a recent case like Lebanon, where a big explosion took place. And it was, the anger was against the corrupt regime and corrupt dynastic regime, which has been siphoning off all the resources in its own coffers. So Macron has made it very clear that France would rebuild Lebanon, but would only do it when there is a government in place which is transparent, which is not corrupt, where this money doesn't go down the drain. So you take something like Cambodia, the same problem is happening there. The Chinese have promised massive aid, but the regime there is not accountable to the people. You take, before Aung San Suu Kyi, the regime in Burma, Myanmar, the situation was very bad. The Rakhine, the Chakma refugees and so on, people don't think that the aid will go to them. And this could be said to various people by point fingers at other countries. The other countries could point fingers at India and say that, look, India has not been using whatever comes to us in times of humanitarian aid. Take a case like Nepal, where India rendered humanitarian aid freely at the time of the earthquake, right after Mr. Modi had been sworn in his first term. And look what has happened. China is in a place where it can define and dictate Nepalese policies against India. So you realize that you have put in a lot of money, your own scarce resources, in supposedly humanitarian aid, and it is being utilized against your interests, and it has gone down to those segments. Take another case like Afghanistan, which has been in the throes of civil war for years, and India has given aid which runs into billions of dollars. At least I remember one tranche of $1 billion given at just one stroke to build bridges, hospitals, schools, etc. And all this money was wasted and went down the drain when Taliban destroyed these things, and the money went into rebuilding these same things. And the money went into the pockets of warlords. So, I mean, you have this situation that where a country is war-torn in civil war, it is a humanitarian crisis. Take a case like Rwanda, Burundi, take a case like Mali, take a case like the whole northwestern tip of Africa, where the legitimate governments are not in a position to stop the brigandage of Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, Nasrul Islam, the Islamic Caliphate of the sub-Saharan states, etc. So how do you assure that the aid is going to the needy and not going to the corrupt ruling elite and so on? So I don't think that this is again one of those confusions like the United Nations, that you talk of a word called humanitarian, and nobody should speak against humanitarian assistance which is being either raised or given. But in real life, there is no such thing as a purely free lunch, as Milton Friedman said. So there is no purely humanitarian aid. All aid is basically given due to strategic reasons. And it is not possible always to say that you are rendering, you take the case of Zimbabwe. Now, Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa. You are another example when Ian Smith, a racist, declared the unilateral declaration of independence way back in 1665, if I remember correctly. And after that, Mugabe ruled there for 4 decades, and the country became a basket case from breadbasket. It started importing food, and you had a reverse racism that the whites were eased out and the economy was ruined. Now, Right now also you don't know what is going to be there. So as long as there is not a structure of governance in a place which can say that humanitarian aid, quote unquote, will be reaching the most needy, you would have people dying of kids dying of malnutrition, people dying of disease, large scale law and order problems, blood diamonds, multinational corporations doing that, and slowly the structure of state being eroded. So I do not think that it is possible in most cases to render humanitarian aid to countries which are not next door, where your own strategic interests are not involved.
Yeah, so the next question is, what is your opinion on the UAE-Israel deal and how do you think it is going to be beneficial for India?
I think that's one of those more rays of optimism, good hope, which you have seen in recent days. Everything else in international affairs has been basically very pessimistic, very distressing, very disturbing. But I think the bridge building between Israel and UAE and Saudi Arab is a very, very nice thing. It helps India maintain its relationship with two of its partners, strategic partners, very well. We have started buying arms from Israel. We share intelligence, which is actionable intelligence, with Israel about counterterrorism. We do collaborate with Israel in very many cutting-edge science and technology projects, from potable water development in arid brackish desert land to growing crops, state-of-the-art cutting-edge surgery, etc. And we don't go into the conflict between Palestine and Israel. We have already thrown our lot on the side of the Israelis. Israelis so far have not bothered with our relationship with Iran, which is a mortal enemy for them. But under American pressure and persuasion, India has also cut down its ties with Iran, so it doesn't bother Israel at all now. Now, also the interesting part is that Indian government has improved its ties with Saudi Arab and UAE in recent past. So if the UAE and Saudi Arab and Israel build bridges and have a rapprochement, it is going to be a win-win situation for both the Saudi Arabs and UAE and Israel and India.
Yes. So
Okay, so the next question we have is, with income and power disparities created by this pandemic, autocratic rule appears to have strengthened in many countries across the globe. How is it likely to affect global growth and coordination?
Good question, Vishal, but again, I have a problem with the formulation of the question. It starts with the assumption that the authoritarian rule has strengthened, reinforced because of the coronavirus. Now, if you look at the historical context, it is very clear that Trump had been elected before the coronavirus broke out. Xi Jinping had ruled in China for quite some years before the coronavirus broke out. Erdogan in Turkey was already in power before the coronavirus had come out. Some would even say that Mr. Modi himself had been elected before the coronavirus came. So all these, and if you take, the Indonesian president, you take the Japanese Shinzo Abe, you take Boris Johnson, you take Macron, you take Angela Merkel, all these people who may be authoritarian in less or more degrees, but the major countries, Putin was there for almost quarter century now. No, not quarter century, 21, 22 years. 1999 was the first time he became the president. So the Putin presiding over the largest country geographically in the world, Xi Jinping presiding over the country most populous in the world, Turkey, a very important strategically located country on the tri-junction of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Before that, Donald Trump, the most powerful nation in the world before that. And you look elsewhere, African continent is not something which I would like to point out to you. But even if you take India, people have pointed out, even if you take Pakistan, people have pointed out. So this trend towards authoritarianism was there before the coronavirus. All that coronavirus gave an opportunity is to the authoritarian leaders already in power to become a little more, less transparent, a little more dictatorial. It applies more to smaller countries. I shouldn't say smaller countries, because the countries like Brazil are pretty big, countries like Egypt are pretty big, countries like, Mexico are pretty big, countries like Venezuela. But everywhere, you have leaders who can only be told, depending on your ideological preferences. It could be a socialist person like Chavez in Venezuela when he died, and then his successor came Maduro, no less dictatorial than Bolsonaro or rightist in Brazil. So you have from Mexico to Venezuela to, to Iran, the Khomeinis. The Saudi Arabia is a pretty authoritarian monarchy, which is an absolute monarchy. The Emirates in the UAE. So what are we talking about? You take Nigerian army and you take so you take any state which matters in international relations, has at the moment a more or less authoritarian.
Yes, so the next question is, China's influence in the African subcontinent has been growing, as you said, under the One Road Belt initiative. So the debt trap policy of China has led to fear of political and geographical hegemony. And how can the investment scheme of India counter the ever-growing influence of our neighbor? So
Look, the point is, the answer to that is very short and unfortunately humiliating. We cannot match the Chinese aid politics in Africa or in the neighborhood. The reason for that is very clear. You see the top 10 economies in the world. The topmost economy, of course, is the United States of America. And after that comes China. And the gap between the Chinese economy and the size of this number 2 economy and number 1 economy is quite a lot. It is close to $10 trillion. But when you come to difference between second to third, Japanese, it is again a marked downfall. Then you come to the fourth, which is still coming down. And India claims to be the fifth. At times it is fifth, at times it is sixth, depending on whether it is pushed past Britain or not pushed past Britain. And the most shocking news is that we have, our GDP has shrunk by about 24% in the recent year, in the past year. So India doesn't compare with China's economic size, scale, etc. So, we have, China started economic liberalization in Deng Xiaoping's time long years ago before India embarked on the path. It has made its economy of a size and scale which India may keep claiming, like our Prime Minister was doing, that we will become in next 5 years a $5 trillion economy. Even if we become, which is not very likely in the post-corona crisis days, that $5 trillion economy would be far smaller than the Chinese economy. And the Chinese have had the advantage of the first mover advantage in Africa, in Nepal, in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, and so on. So they already have got most of what they wanted. The Habantota port, the foothold in Indonesia, foothold in Cambodia, pressure tactics in Myanmar and Nepal. Pakistan is practically in their pocket with the One Belt, One Road alternative. Even countries in Europe like Italy have enthusiastically joined the poor countries in Europe, the OBR and the Greece and the Cyprus. So the Chinese have a position, which would again is wishful thinking that we can match China everywhere and have a level of clarity. No. So India keeps talking of its soft power, and China has been flexing its economic muscle and its military power, demonstrating it. So I think Indians will have to learn to cope with China as a hostile, dominant, aggressive power in Asia, and try to cope with it through a variety of responses, part diplomatic, part military, part economic, and try to build one's own economy, which is not going to be easy. It is easier prescribed than followed.
So, Nepal recently witnessed some political tensions whereby the Prime Minister claimed that the people were conspiring to remove him from his position. What is your take on it, and will it have any impact on its neighboring countries?
No, I mean, when you say neighboring countries, it's either India or China or maybe Bhutan, which is next door, because Nepal is a landlocked country. It doesn't share border with other countries like very many other countries. I mean, even the Bhutanese are through India's chicken snake in Siliguri sector. So, it will of course have some fact if you have a prime minister who's decidedly hostile to you. I think Mr. Kohli has done lasting damage to Indo-Nepal relations, and it will take some time to undo them. In past, there was a very anti-Indian Nepalese prime minister called Tulsi Giri, but then there was an absolute monarchy in Nepal. and he could be tamed, ousted, etc. There have been very friendly Nepalese prime ministers like the Koirala people belonging to Koirala family, but they have not been very popular in Nepal because it is easy to defame them as Indian agents. I do not think that the prime minister's role in deciding relationship with a country like India or China is very important. Without any offense meant to the Nepalese, they are a very small country and they cannot afford to, like Prithvi Narayan Shah Malla, the king who established the Gorkha regime, did say that Nepal is like a yam between two big rocks, China and India, and it cannot afford to antagonize either. When Nepal forgets this, it can only, it is like cutting your nose to spite the face. The Nepalese can claim that they are very self-respecting, they have great pride in their nation, but so does India. So India also has this problem that if Indian nationalism is aroused, then Nepal cannot expect that Indians will look at it silently and pocket all the insults. So it only doesn't really matter in long run. What matters is the Chinese spreading their influence in Nepal and how India copes with it, or Pakistan.
So how do you think the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan is going to impact the relation of the latter with her neighboring countries?
You see, you are very vague, when you say neighboring countries. Now, like Nepal, Afghanistan is also a landlocked country. But Afghanistan shares a border with other countries in Central Asia. Not only India doesn't share a border with it, it shares a border with Pakistan, it shares a border with Iran, westward it is extended towards the Middle East. Now, nobody is bothered about how Afghanistan impacts on their relationship. Please keep in mind the history. In 1970s, the Soviet forces, Russia was called Soviet Union then, occupied Afghanistan. After that, the Americans, when they were eased out, Taliban and the Mujahideen took over. And then the Americans took over. So for the past almost half a century and more, Afghanistan has been a country occupied by foreign forces of a major power, a superpower, either Russia or before that, the Americans. Before that, it was the British influence there. And everybody followed a policy of controlling Kabul and having a policy of live and let live with rebels, the drug mafia, the arms mafia, the warlords, the tribal chieftains. And it has been a country divided into these territories, So you would have Rashid Dostan, you would have Ulbin Ahmadiyar, you would have Haqqanis, you would have these people who are basically lawless tribal chieftains. And Afghanistan has never been a modern state at all. It is a state created as a buffer against the Russian expansion by the British colonial period. It has never attained a national statehood. So you can't compare Afghanistan as a nation state. It continues to be a country which is almost like Khuda Gawah, Kabliwala, and so on. So these images of Afghanistan, that Afghanistan matters. India fell for it when the Americans tried to provoke, encourage India into thinking that if it has influence in Afghanistan, it would surround Pakistan from both sides. The moment India fell for this strategy of trying to increase its presence in Afghanistan, a young foreign officer lost his life, and the embassy was repeatedly attacked, and no real influence has come to India at all because Pakistan felt threatened and increased its activities in Jammu and Kashmir region. So I do not think that Afghanistan in present context matters for when you say other countries to India. Let's worry more about Pakistan next door. Let's worry more about the proxy war in Jammu and Kashmir. Let us worry more about the activities of terrorists, which may include Afghans, which may include Sudanese. Let's worry about the radicalization of Indian youth from Kerala who are going to mount an attack in Kabul, a suicide attack. So that threat to my mind is far more important. They are not being radicalized in Afghanistan. They are only going to get killed in Afghanistan. They are being radicalized in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, in Iraq. And that's something which we should worry about. Let the Americans withdraw. Let the Americans worry about their interests. Now the news reports have come that Taliban were being bribed by Putin to kill top-level American generals and army positions in Afghanistan. So why do we want to get caught into this game? And it relates to another question which Vishal had asked a little earlier. How do you, or had you asked that question? How do you render humanitarian assistance in a hopeless situation? It's like an emergency ward in a hospital. The patient will just not survive. So why are you going to waste efforts on that patient where the scarce resources can be used somewhere else? So I would much rather not focus on what happens to Afghanistan and to Indo-Afghan relations when Americans withdraw. Americans have practically withdrawn, left it to the Taliban. The Taliban are not going to be in a hurry to redeem all their promises made to Americans. I think the drug trafficking will not stop overnight because the Americans are the ones who are the consumers of drugs. I think the Pakistanis are going to find it very convenient to have Afghanistan destabilized so they don't have to worry about Pashtun rebellion in their northwest territories and the tribal areas. As long as the lava flows in from Afghanistan to Pakistan in Pindi and so on, Pakistan would be directing it towards India. But then the problem is not Afghanistan, the problem is Pakistan.
Sir, the final question. One of the topics doing the rounds nowadays is the upcoming US elections. How do you think that the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to the office will impact the India-US ties?
It doesn't really make a difference, because I think Kamala Harris is a person of Indian origin, but there are so many persons of Indian origin after they become American citizens or they are born as American citizens, their primary loyalty is to their nation, the way it should be. The history also tells us that the Indo-American relations have probably been slightly better when the Republican governments are there. When the democratic government is there, the chances are that they are more critical of our human rights records. They try to be more outspoken. They are a little better informed, shall I say, about the Indian context. And that's why more meddlesome. So despite the great personal chemistry between Mr. Modi and Obama, actually not much came out of that relationship for India. Go back a little earlier, Americans look after their own interests. The Bush was very, again, with the moment the people used to joke that the only time one could see Manmohan Singh smile was when he was standing next to George Bush Jr. But then the problem was that even that 1, 2, 3 peace agreement for peaceful uses of nuclear energy did not take us anywhere else. It was ultimately an American business deal for companies like GE and Westinghouse to sell their nuclear plants to India. Nobody is talking about that. It only succeeded in scuttling the Tapi line pipeline, which was coming from Turkmenistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and bring Russian gas to India. And they sabotaged only that gas pipeline, the North-South corridor, our relationship with Iran and Russia. But that nobody is talking of nuclear energy anymore, including a country like France, which generated 25% of its electricity almost of nuclear sources. So that's why they are dependent on Russian gas and the Nord to Stream submarine channel. So I think, the Americans have taken India for a very comfortable ride. They say that we are having a strategic partnership, let us have Indo-Pacific exercises, let's have Quad. Then they suddenly say that we are not interested in that, we are into America first, and then Indians are left alone out in the cold. So whether it is a Republican government, whether it is a Democratic government, it doesn't really make much of a difference unless the Indians, like the Chinese, make themselves indispensable in terms of economy to the Americans. Now, please look at it. The Americans have imposed trade sanctions against China, inaugurated almost a trade war. But the Americans have also abused India, if I may use the word cautiously, in similar manner, that Indians are taking away jobs from Americans, the business process outsourcing services, H-1B visas and other kinds of things. So the Americans have also held it against Indians that they are having cheaper products, and they said that if American companies continue to do this, A, in China, B, in India, they will have to pay a price for this. So I don't think that any American government, Republican or Democrat, whether it is Trump or Pence or Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, is going to make too great a difference.
Yes.
Sir, we thank you for taking out time from your busy schedule for this interview. Your views on the topics have broadened our knowledge and vision and will surely help us and our viewers in understanding international relations much more better way. Thank you once again, sir, for this insightful interview.
Thank you, Vishal, and thank you, Akshay. I enjoyed myself. Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.